Energy and Environment to Tuesday, June 7th, and it is about 10 after 9 a.m. in the morning. We are in room 1010 in Los Angeles City Hall. Let's see. Why don't we take one very quickly, because two is the big item here.
Certainly. Madam Chair, good morning. This is Rafael Prado with the CLA's office. Item number 1 relates to a CAO report relative to proposed amendment number 1 to contract with Gatekeeper Systems for field automation for sanitation trucks.
Two quick questions, and maybe you can just tailor your comments to that. Just tell us the types of services covered by the contract and how the Bureau has used them for the first 3 years, and is there sufficient funding for this project in the SEM fund so that the contract will not ever draw on the city's general fund?
Hello, my name is Anita Fernandez. I'm with the Bureau of Sanitation. And basically, the services covered under this contract will include maintenance and support services, which are annual software costs for the use of the Navigate products, which are proprietary to Gatekeeper Systems. And it also provides for enhancement services, which usually result from enhancements or upgrades to other systems that this application interfaces with. So we would have a mechanism to pay for that. Basically, over the past 3 years, we've only used, or the majority of it has been used for the maintenance and support services of the applications. And just on a discretionary basis, we've used a small amount, like I believe $12,000, towards enhancement services.
And good morning, Mara Carla, Office of the CEO. And there are sufficient funds in the sewer construction and maintenance fund to support this contract.
Okay, very good then. Mr. Krikorian, do you have any questions on this one? Okay, great. All right, well then we'll move this item.
Recommend approval?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, item number 2 relates to the joint CAO-CLA report in response to motion Perry, Smith, Garcetti, Rosendahl relative to actions and ordinances necessary to implement Charter Amendment I. This matter was continued from your April 25th meeting. At that time, the committee issued a variety of instructions, one for our office and the CAO to jointly report with respect to the Citizens Committee, and as well a variety of legal questions and for the City Attorney's Office, as well as instructions to them to initiate the implementation ordinances as well. We have a report that was submitted by the City Attorney this morning with respect to a variety of legal questions which came up during that meeting. Perhaps we could have them present that.
Good morning. Okay, and that's Mr. Merkin is here for the legal questions,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
Great. Okay, great. And we just have one card on this at one point, Mr. Ray. So why don't we do the staff report, and then I'll call you up. Okay? Great.
Yes.
Who goes first?
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, Frederick Merkin, outside counsel assisting the City Attorney. You have in front of you a report from the City Attorney's Office with regard to implementation. It's divided into 2 parts. The first responds to a number of legal questions that have come up in regard to the implementation, and I'll walk through each of those in just a moment. The second deals with essentially a checklist of instructions we're looking for ultimately from the council, first from this committee, a recommendation to the council, to instruct the drafting of the implementing administrative code provision and ordinance, and also the initial implementing budget for the Office of Public Accountability. If I may begin with some of the legal questions, the first has to do with the possibility of phasing in implementation. We do have within the charter provision, section 683, an operative date of the charter provision of July 1st of this year. That would mean that the Citizens Committee, the Executive Director appointment, and all the other actions to be taken are to happen on or after July 1st. And of necessity, those could not happen all at one time because you couldn't have a Citizens Committee until July 1st. That committee has to do its business and ultimately select, subject to confirmation, Executive Director, which would happen at a later point. And the Executive Director, him or herself, is the appointing authority of the staff of the Office of Public Accountability, and that would happen at even a later point. What has been discussed is essentially a 2-phased form of implementation, with the first phase having as its goal bringing on board as expeditiously as possible the executive director, with perhaps a complement of a very small support staff initially, with the executive director then being able to be part of the deliberations of this body, the council, and others within city government in regard to what kind of Office of Public Accountability do you want to establish, what kind of resources are going to be required by way of staff and other resources, and what kind of funding would be required. So the first question before us is it possible to do that? And the answer is yes. It is possible to move in phases. Of necessity, you have to do it anyway. And along that line, what you would have is really two sets of ordinances, at least. The first would be two ordinances, an administrative code provision, which would establish the Citizens Committee, and a few other provisions with regard to the executive director primarily, and an initial budgetary ordinance for the Office of Public Accountability. And these would together would start the ball rolling, so to speak, and then at a later point, after the executive director is on board and deliberations have been completed and decisions are made as to how to develop and flesh out the Office of Public Accountability, you'd have a second set of ordinances. The administrative code provision would be amended to add reporting requirements, consumer complaint procedures, other duties perhaps of the of the Office of Public Accountability. You'd have a supplementary budget ordinance, which would bring in additional resources to fund this expanded, this developed Office of Public Accountability. So the first question is, can this be done? The answer is, it can be done. The second question that has arisen concerns the Citizens Committee, which by charter is charged with the responsibility of appointing the executive director subject to confirmation by the mayor and the council. The question is whether the Citizens Committee itself can continue as an oversight or managerial body after the executive director has been appointed. The answer to that question is no. The Citizens Committee was established for a limited purpose, one purpose only, the appointment of the executive director. Now, it is possible, and I think we're recommending, and I think the CAO and CLA are recommending, that the Citizens Committee need not be dissolved upon appointment, because you could have, for example, an appointment that's not confirmed. You could have an appointee who, after a month, resigns. One possibility is perhaps 6 months or up to 12 months duration after the initial appointment for this committee to be available again to consider an appointment to the position of executive director.
Recommending like a standing committee that is activated on an as-needed basis?
It would be as needed, but the only need would be the need to appoint. If there were no sole function, there's no oversight or managerial authority. If there were, you see, it would be a derogation of the authority of the executive director, because the executive director would no longer have the full managerial responsibility that the charter intended that he or she have. The next question concerns whether the initial budget for the Office of Public Accountability can be proposed by the CAO. The answer to that question is yes. Why is that question even asked? The charter provides that it's the executive director who proposes the budget to the CAO. Of course, at this moment, at the beginning, you do not have an executive director, but you do need an initial budget just to fund selecting the executive director. Therefore, of necessity, some way has to be found to fund that initial effort, and we think that the structure of the charter provision is such that that responsibility should be with the CAO. Next question. As part of the initial startup of the Office of Public Accountability, can that budget include funds associated with selecting the executive director? And the answer is yes. That initial budget would actually deal largely with, or much with, the selection of the executive director. And it might include, for example, an executive search fee, it's not required, but it conceivably could happen. So we're recommending that that there be the ability of the CAO to essentially gather the various costs related to selecting the executive director and make that part of the initial budget of the Office of Public Accountability. This question that has come up concerns whether the executive director and the ratepayer advocate may be the same person. The answer to that question is no. What was contemplated by the charter provision is that there be an executive director, and also there was contemplation there be someone who is identified as the ratepayer advocate. Now, that's not to say that the ratepayer advocate has a monopoly on ratepayer advocacy. That's not the case at all.
What do you mean?
In other words, the ratepayer advocate would have as his or her primary responsibility ratepayer advocacy, but that is not to deny to the executive director, for example, that very same
See, I think
ability.
I don't know. We have to look at the language on that again. To me, that muddies the water. I mean, the whole point of having a ratepayer advocate is to be this third, disinterested, dispassionate, analytical individual, self-contained. You know, I don't know that we wanted to create a department where you have a ratepayer advocate and then somebody else running around acting like they're the ratepayer advocate too, and getting in the way of the person who ultimately is the first word in impartial analysis. So I think that's something we need to drill down a little bit on.
Yeah, one thing is
From an operational standpoint, you know, I can see where there's first we have to adhere to the language of what we passed.
correct.
That's number one. From an operational perspective, if there is some way to look at this language, you know, the rationale behind it, I'm not sure the rationale was to have an RPA and then have somebody else can kind of do that too. I suspect that is not the case.
Well, bear in mind, the ratepayer advocate is a staff member. The head of the Office of Public Accountability is the executive director,
Right.
who has the ability to instruct the ratepayer advocate, all the employees within the Office of Public Accountability. This is the person who makes the decisions within the Office of Public Accountability as the executive director, not the ratepayer advocate. And so if you look at the charter provision with regard to the powers that were given the executive director are very similar to the powers given to general managers of departments.
So if you follow that logic, though, the RPA is the one who does the analysis, basically the impartial analysis, the staff report, the recommendations, and publishes that, and then the ED is the one who imparts it to the rest of us.
Not necessarily.
Well, what do you mean?
No. The executive director can determine within that unit who's to do what. For example, the ratepayer advocate may be the person who's out front, if you will, with regard to making analyses of rate proposals, with regard to interfacing with the department on complaints by customers. The executive director may say that there are certain matters where I, as executive director, ought to appear before the Board of Water and Power Commissioners. That is a legitimate decision on the part of the person who's the head of that unit. So there could be, but it's up to the executive director how best to allocate responsibility, because that's his or her responsibility as head of that unit.
Well, I appreciate it, Fred. I think we're going to have to drill down deeper on that because, you know, the whole point of having a ratepayer advocate was hopefully to get somebody with some expertise, water and power, and the ability to analyze rate increases and their impacts, not only the department's bottom line, but on the ratepayer. Obviously, customer complaints come along with that too, and they're ultimately involved in ratepayer issues. But I don't know that we contemplated that. It sounds like the makings of potential for chaos. You know, I know that's not what we intended, but let's get through your report so we can all ask questions.
Surely. The next question is sort of related. While the executive director has been appointed, but there is no ratepayer advocate at this point, may the executive director engage in ratepayer advocacy? The answer is yes, for the reasons I had explained. this person is the head of the entire unit, has responsibility and can do that, pending, but there must be the appointment of ratepayer advocate, because it's called for by the charter provision. There are a couple of other matters that should be part of the implementing ordinance. What is to be done if there's a vacancy in the executive director position, or the person is incapacitated or is unavailable? The implementing ordinance should have some means of identifying a person who should serve as acting executive director in the absence of the executive director. Now, this would be done in 2 phases. Bear in mind, the initial implementation would have essentially just an executive director and perhaps some support staff. So you would need someone identified who's perhaps outside of that unit, would have to be, I would think, to serve as executive director, pending development of the Office of Public Accountability. Once the ratepayer advocate is on board, it's possible that the ratepayer advocate becomes the acting executive director, and we could write the ordinance, the supplemental ordinance, that way. But there's going to be a need at the beginning to have somebody who's there so you know there's a backup for the executive director. A sort of a similar type of issue arises to what if there's a need to put the executive director on administrative leave. It's not something we want to contemplate, but it's just the nature of things that it could happen. There could be some circumstance that developed where really it's imperative that that person should be put on suspension pending investigation. Well, who has authority to do it? There is no superior to the executive director, because the executive director reports to the Board of Water and Power Commissioners, but is not instructed by the Board of Water and Power Commissioners. The executive director can be removed by the City Council. One possibility, for example, is for the council president or the mayor in that ordinance to be given the authority to impose an order of suspension pending investigation, perhaps with confirmation by the City Council as soon as reasonably practicable thereafter. So that's something that needs to be attended to, I think, in the initial ordinance. So those are the legal questions we've asked. And, of course, at the end of this discussion, I'd like to go through a checklist of items to make sure we're complete in terms of the items for the ordinance.
Did the CAO want to make a report?
The reference to Bill Koenig, CAO's office, the couple of references regarding the budget and things of this nature, we can easily accomplish that task. It shouldn't be a problem.
A couple questions, and then also for the record, Mr. Perez has joined us. Just for a little bit, Fred, can you tell me why a 5-member commission, citizens committee, works effectively in terms of a model like this? And do you have an appointment term you're recommending?
Appointment term? What do you mean?
Like, how long would somebody stay on this? If you leave it standing.
Oh, yes. I think, yeah. I would think that one way of dealing with this is that after the initial appointment of the executive director, this committee could remain available for somewhere between 6 and 12 months after that appointment. And so if you had a need, let's say 8 months later, to make another appointment to executive director, that very same committee could be recalled, and they could perform that same duty. But let's say it's a year and a half later. At that point, you would form a new executive committee using the ordinance, and the new appointments would be made.
Madam Chair, just so you know, the 5-member committee option is something that our office has recommended with the CAO as part of our report.
Okay.
We could explain that if you like as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Would you?
What in our review of the charter amendment, what we determined was that in essence, this committee is in essence an executive hiring panel. And consistent with that, we found that most of those hiring panels tend to be from 3 to 5 members, no more than that, because it becomes unwieldy to have a larger panel if you're hiring personnel and so forth. So as a result, we came up with this 5-member option for your consideration, and as such, come up with some appointment authorities with respect to that.
Okay, thank you. I think the report indicated that the mayor and the council president be designated as appointing authorities. I'm correct about that, am I not?
I'm not with you on that.
Those components, Bill Koenig, CAO's office, that question was addressed within the CAO-CLA report. And yes, we identified those two.
And what do you recommend, how many would the mayor be able to appoint, and how many would the...
We are recommending in the report that 3 members of the committee be appointed by the council and 2 members be appointed by the mayor.
Okay.
The president of the city council, excuse me.
Council president. And then why did you limit it to the council president and not the council?
It's a policy decision on the part of the council. We were just looking at it as the head of the city council is the president.
Yeah.
And it could be modified. It could be, for example, also a member of this committee here could also be.
Well, I would recommend at least, I'll talk to the council president, but
Sure.
this is on chair of energy and environment, maybe he has 3 appointments?
Correct. That's the recommended
Maybe ask
number.
him for, I would talk to him and see if I can ask him for 1, but we can do that in council.
Certainly.
And your report also envisions a very vital role for the personnel department in a support capacity. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Correct, because the personnel department is obviously involved with all personnel matters. This is a major appointment. It's a major executive position for the city. They can offer the assistance of identifying the confidentiality issues that are associated with any type of interviews, any appointments. They can conduct an executive search if, in fact, it is chosen. We are not saying it has to be, but it could be if it's the call of the appointment committee. It's basically to ensure that city policies and procedures, which are based on all the city rules and regulations, are in fact adhered to, because this is a personnel issue.
Is there anybody here for personnel right
Yes,
now?
there are representatives. You wish to
Yeah, I just want to ask them a quick question. You could just provide us with some input on your department's perspective as it relates to executive management hiring, and I'm particularly interested, as you know, this ratepayer advocate position is going to be a very specific, highly unique position, which will require someone with unique and very targeted qualifications. And I don't know what experience the personnel department has had in dealing with a situation like that, but I'd just like to get a little input as to what your perspective or the department's perspective would be on that.
Scott DeYoung, Personnel Department. The executive recruitment section is located within the Personnel Department. We've conducted a number of searches for high-level executives. Recently, we completed the executive director for the Ethics Commission. We've done inspector general for the police department. So while we don't have any specific experience in the ratepayer advocacy area, we do have staff that is experienced in identifying where to go out and look for folks with specific qualifications. Obviously, we would work very closely with everybody that's involved, including the Citizens Committee, with our own classification division to determine what the requirements are going to be for the position, what kind of experience we're looking for, so that we can put together a recruitment plan to find the most qualified people.
And once your recruitment plan is put back together, I'd like for you to come back and review it with the committee.
Okay.
So, Mr. CLA, would you make sure that happens? All right, thank you. Mr. Krikorian, who would ask some questions?
Thank you. I do, on this particular point, I understand that the budget ordinance for this would have to be kind of a 2-step process, an initial funding pot to get the process going, to set up the commission, to do the appointment, and then a more robust one after we have really worked out the details of how the office is going to operate, what the recommendations of the executive director would be, I assume, for what will be necessary to perform those tasks. The part of this that's missing to me is, how do we hire the executive director in the first place? An appointment is made. Someone has to negotiate with that person. There has to be a budget amount set aside for the salary that person is going to be paid. And I haven't seen a recommendation anywhere in this how we deal with that component. Would personnel handle the mechanics of the negotiation, and the budget for salary be something that would be up to the council to set? Who would do that, and how much, what would the budget be that could be extended before the Citizens Commission is disbanded?
Again, Bill Koenig, CAO's office. Once these specific duties and responsibilities are in fact identified, then the CAO's office would undertake a determination as to what the appropriate salary would be. That would necessitate an ordinance and would have to be approved by the mayor and council.
Okay, so before the Citizens Commission is even prepared to move forward, we will have to revisit the issue of what is the mission of the executive director, what are the specific tasks that will be asked of the executive director, and what's an appropriate compensation level to pay somebody with the qualifications necessary.
That would also be necessary for the recruitment activities, because anybody who's going to applying for this job wants to know what's it going to pay.
Right. And as of now, I mean, we're still having discussion as to exactly what the position is going to look like. What is the mission of the executive director?
The dilemma we're facing right now is to put all of these pieces together to, in fact, make a package that can then be made to a candidate to be offered.
Okay. So now, related to that, going back to this sort of bifurcation of the positions, what I'm envisioning is that there will be an executive director who will have a variety of responsibilities for that office over which he or she oversees to perform. One will be advocacy on behalf of ratepayers to ensure the lowest and most appropriate rates. Two will be as an ombudsperson for customer complaints. And three would be as an inspector general in instances of wrongdoing and so on within the department. And I think those were the three areas that have been discussed in council, at least, as being potentially within the jurisdiction of the executive director to perform.
Well, the first
So
two...
you look pained about that. So
I think this... Yeah. No, the first two are...
it's the nature of the business.
Occupational hazard. The first two, analysis of rates and dealing with consumer complaints, customer complaints, are certainly identified in the material before the voters. The role of the executive director as inspector general is something that will require further deliberation.
Okay.
I'd rather just leave it at that at this point.
That's fine. So this distinction that you're drawing between the executive director and the ratepayer advocate, I share Ms. Perry's concerns about diffusion of accountability here. But wouldn't it be the case that the executive director ultimately is the person responsible for all of the duties of that office?
Correct.
And if the executive director chooses to hire a person whose title is ratepayer advocate, ultimately it is the executive director who is serving the responsibilities and is going to be held accountable for performing the mission of the Office of Public Accountability, including ratepayer advocacy.
Correct.
Okay. So those other responsibilities of ombudsperson and so on could be performed by one or more staff members who would also report to the executive director.
They would all report to the executive director, and the ratepayer advocate would do ratepayer advocacy. I mean, that is called for as well in the...
Sure, but it could be the assistant deputy of ratepayer advocacy, but it is the executive director, and we've gotten sidetracked, I think, in a lot of this discussion by titles. Ultimately, the executive director is the person that ratepayers can expect to hold accountable for ensuring that rates are fair.
That is correct,
Okay.
because the ratepayer advocate is a subordinate to the executive director, an appointee of the executive director.
This is a little problematic because all of the public dialogue out in the in the public discourse and among us has been the ratepayer advocate is going to be is what we're seeking. But in fact, everything that everyone is thinking of as the ratepayer advocate is going to be the responsibility of the executive director.
Correct.
Well, I think it's more of an operational question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
That's
where the rate, I mean, I envision the RPA being somebody who is basically self-contained operation, impartial, able, and then they give their report to their boss. And because of the nature of what they do, it may be so technical that the ED may not be able to impart that information to the public in a way that the ratepayer advocate could, because the ratepayer advocate, I'm certainly going to push for somebody who has a high level of expertise, which the average layperson may not have. So Mr. Alarcon is here, and Mr. Perret said you have questions.
Yeah, first, not so much a question, just an opinion. And the ratepayer advocate, I probably have a different point of view may be closer to Ms. Perry's. I think I and the public, and I would say certainly a significant number of council members, if not most of them, envision the ratepayer advocate as the ratepayer advocate, not the ratepayer advocate and the executive director doing ratepayer advocacy, and in theory even being able to speak with two voices rather than one voice. So I would envision the ratepayer advocate as the one voice of ratepayer advocacy in that department, unless the charter tells us otherwise. And I would certainly, if I was joined by 7 of my colleagues, direct that to be set up exactly that way. I wouldn't expect to have the executive director out there doing the advocacy. I think it would operate more the way most nonprofits do, where the executive director does the work in the background, and the lay president might well be the voice and the face of the organization. So I don't know how we got off in this different direction, unless there's something in the charter that tells us to do that.
Well, the charter does say the executive director is in charge.
Right. Well, it would be like any organization,
well,
as I envisioned.
And has. I do appreciate the point you're making about having more than one voice, and there shouldn't be in any organization like that. It should speak with one voice, but the voice is determined by the executive director, because that person has accountability, responsibility. That's the person who's selected by the committee and is confirmed, not the ratepayer advocate, who is an appointee of the executive director. So there is to be only one voice, but this notion that ratepayer advocacy is the exclusive province of the ratepayer advocate, that one employee, you may need a number of employees in certain situations to do the job. And it may take the executive director to be out front on certain issues, but that is an operational question within the purview of the executive director.
Well, to be honest, I think it should be in the purview of the council, and we should set the parameters rather than leaving it the direction that you're speaking of. As far as questions, I only have one question. It's been suggested to me at a couple places that of this 5-member committee, one of them should be from the neighborhood councils. Has anyone looked at any kind of parameters in terms of what the makeup is of the citizen committee that's going to select the executive director, other than just who's doing the appointing?
We haven't gotten that deep into it. What we have looked at is perhaps you could designate the flavors of each of the 5 members with respect to perhaps a designee from labor, environmental community, neighborhood councils, or community organizing, and so forth. And perhaps that's something that could, assist the appointing authorities with respect to who to place on there.
And probably even, if you're going that far, a business representative as well, since there's certainly impact.
Second-tier representative, something like that.
So just a thought to raise to be.
To truly understand the meaning of the ballot measure, you, I think, need to delve into what was the original intent of the council. Mr. Merkin, have you reviewed the discussions of the council as we created that ballot measure?
Not lately. I was one of the people involved in drafting the measure based on those instructions.
Mm-hmm. But you haven't reviewed the discussion we had regarding it? Because your interpretation of the executive director is, I believe, far afield from what we talked about in council. And I believe that the charter amendment as written is subject to interpretation, which should be based on the discussion that we had.
Well, the primary guide to interpretation is the language of the charter amendment. Secondary material you would look to would be what else was before the voters. Because the ballot question...
What I'm suggesting to you is that
the independent analysis of the independent summary of the chief legislative analyst and the argument in favor of the measure.
Yeah, but what I'm suggesting to you is that language in the charter amendment as presented to the voters is subject to interpretation. And that interpretation can be can be further understood by understanding what the intent of the council was when we established it. So let me tell you what I remember. What I remember is that the ratepayer advocate was indeed a quasi-independent individual who was going to advocate on behalf of the ratepayers. I did not see that as being subsumed by a supervisor, an executive director. The function of the executive director was to manage the Office of Accountability, which goes far beyond the issues of ratepayer advocacy. And so, no, I don't think that the executive director speaks for the ratepayer advocate. I agree with Mr. Koretz, and I believe Ms. Perry on that point. And I'm not suggesting that I understand the supervisorial nature of the executive director and the ratepayer advocate, but I don't believe that relationship subsumes the responsibility of the ratepayer advocate to be quasi-independent.
Well, I must respectfully disagree with one particular fundamental point. It is very clear in the charter provision that the executive director is in charge of that operation. Just
Charge of the operation, I agree.
And gives instructions to, and that the ratepayer advocate reports to the executive director.
I think he reports to the public.
No. The
We
executive
wasted our
director,
time then.
the ratepayer advocate is an employee within the unit.
I get
The
that.
head of the,
I mean, by your thinking, the head of DWP is the ratepayer advocate. By that logic,
no,
does the executive director report to the head of the DWP?
no,
No?
No.
Who do they report to?
executive director reports to no one. I strike that. It reports to the Board of Water and Power Commissioners.
Oh, there you go.
But it says it's not instructed by the Board of Water and Power Commissioners. That's why you have independence in the Office of Public Accountability. The executive director really does not have a boss, other than the ability of the council by 10 votes to remove the executive director. This person is independent, which was the goal of the measure, independence.
Yeah.
And this person is put in charge, has powers very similar to a general manager's powers. Ratepayer advocate is an employee within the unit who's instructed by, reports to the executive director. That is the charter language, and that is going to govern. It's so clear that I don't see any way around that.
I'm not suggesting we go around that charter language. What I'm suggesting is that the ratepayer advocate does have a level of independence, that they do have a responsibility to report to the general public.
No, I think we're maybe talking about the same thing in a different way. The Office of Public Accountability has just what you're looking for: independence, reporting to the public on ratepayer advocacy. What we're quibbling over is the individuals within that unit, who's to do what. The executive director is going to have that responsibility to the public.
I don't view it that way.
And
I mean, why would we create a ratepayer advocate position if we were going to give that responsibility to somebody else? No. I agree with Ms. Perry. The function of the executive director is an operations function and not an advocacy function per se. They are to ensure that the ratepayer advocate is functioning as an advocate, but they are not the advocate. Otherwise, we would have made them the advocate. The executive director is a manager of this organization, and they have a responsibility to ensure that there's transparency at DWP, or to work toward transparency at DWP, but the ratepayer advocate is focused on rates.
well, the ratepayer advocate is focused on advocating for
the ratepayers. So, okay, it could include service. But the Office of Public Accountability, doesn't it go further than that?
It has all the responsibilities that the charter amendment places within it, and the two that are prominent are with regard to scrutinizing rates and dealing with customer complaints.
Right.
Those are the two prominent purposes of the Office of Public Accountability that is clear from the materials before the voter.
Okay, now, when you say dealing with customer complaints, at the same time you say that they do not report to DWP. I mean, they do not have any authority to change the service. They can just
Correct.
report about it.
Yeah, the Office of Public Accountability.
When you say dealing with complaints, what exactly do you mean?
Well, they can establish procedures for taking complaints for customers, presenting complaints to the department, and essentially advocating the just resolution from the Office of Public Accountability standpoint of that complaint.
I just don't want to, we got to be very careful not to send the wrong message to the public, because dealing with a complaint means you're fixing it, and they don't have the authority to fix it. All they have the authority to do is to present it to the department and try to work something out, which yeah, that's very much their function. I'm just concerned that we were, several of us, the majority of this committee apparently believed the ratepayer advocate was going to have a little more teeth, and what you're suggesting is something less than what we envisioned.
Let me say, I think that I must respectfully disagree. I think it's a question of
That's
semantics.
okay, we can disagree.
No. For example, the person who becomes executive director could have all the technical wherewithal, all the communicative skills that you're looking for in a ratepayer advocate. And the ratepayer advocate could have those same skills as well. Okay? So in terms of accomplishing the job that you may have in mind and providing and the purposes that the voters had in mind.
Wait a minute. No, I'm talking about what the council intended. And if we intended that person to be the ratepayer advocate, we would have made him the ratepayer advocate. In fact, there was an argument to do that. I mean, it was first presented as, should it be an inspector general or a ratepayer advocate? And I don't know when it turned into an executive director, but we couched it when it became an Office of Public Accountability. We put a ratepayer advocate in there. I think it's distinctly different than the executive director function.
Well, we followed instructions, and
it's sort of like the manager of a hospital who isn't the surgeon. Totally different. And I don't think the charter.
But then again, you have to be able the power to give instruction. Let's take, for example, the city attorney has to be able to instruct subordinate attorneys. And you need to have what it takes to understand what kind of instructions and direction to give.
No, but the city attorney's an attorney. That's a bad example. I gave a better example. The general manager of a hospital is not typically a doctor. It's a manager. And I think that's what this position is. And I don't think there's anything in the charter that says it's anything different. Otherwise, we would have called it ratepayer advocate / ED. I think you're wrong, Fred. I think you should go back and check my interpretation and listen to the conversation of the council when we directed what the ordinance should contain. Not the ordinance, but what the measure before the voters should contain.
I think we're going to have a little powwow here in a minute, because this isn't working for me today either. And Mr. Gregory wants to say something.
Look, we went off the tracks here because of what the titles we're giving these positions. We never should call the technocrat in the office the ratepayer advocate. He's not. He or she is not. The executive director is the ratepayer advocate. The executive director is the person who has the public's accountability to advocate for rates. To do that job, they need the technical expertise of somebody within the office. I have a policy director in my office. But my policy director does not direct policy. I do. I'm the one that's accountable to the voters. So, yes, they have to advise me. Yes, I look to them for their expertise. But I'm the one that's responsible and accountable to no one else other than the voters. In the same way, I wish we hadn't called it an executive director. We should not have. But the thing is, we got so muddled in literally months of debate in council because no one could decide, should it be an inspector general, should it be a ratepayer advocate, should it be a barbecue. I mean, we couldn't come up with, we couldn't come up with the appropriate terminology, which to me was a waste of time. The responsibility and the line of accountability is what matters, not whether you call it blue or green. And so, to me, the way this has been structured is intentionally done so that the executive director, and I hate the phrase because you're right, Richard, that does sound like a functional manager. It doesn't sound like, but it isn't. It isn't if we define the mission and responsibility and job description of the executive director to include ratepayer advocacy.
Okay, so what we're going to have...
That's all you need to do. You have to define the job description of the executive director as including advocacy for the consumers, advocacy for ratepayers, and so on. And then you could call it, grand poobah of, consumer advocacy or whatever you want. It doesn't matter what you call it. It matters how you define the position and its responsibilities, how you fund the position, how you staff the position to make sure that the ratepayer advocate, executive director, inspector general, grand poobah has enough tools in their toolbox to be able to fight for ratepayers. That's what we want.
Make that into a motion?
Yes, I'd like to move that the name of the position be Grand Poobah.
How about the other stuff?
With a hat.
Yeah, let's do the, serious.
I don't know how
I'm gonna
to
ask
phrase it
CLA.
as a motion
Okay,
without
wait.
opening up the box to further discussion about
Well,
titles, as we,
we're gonna have further discussion
did
about
lots and lots of already in council.
Yeah,
I
but
think
obviously, we're not in agreement yet. We're not in agreement yet. Let the CLA come for, CLA, tell us what you can do for us to help bring clarity to this situation.
The good thing is...
That adheres to the language that the voters passed.
Sure. The good thing is that the decision about the roles and responsibilities of the executive director, ratepayer advocate, don't have to be decided today or within the next month or so. That is something to be left down the road. The next big step from this point, before anything can proceed, is a citizens committee. Set that up, because that panel needs to select and start developing and so forth who this person is going to be, and implementing ordinances relate to the budget, the funding for this effort, as well as simple things like the removal of the executive director and so forth, which are clearly stated in the charter amendment. I think instructions from this committee should be with respect to moving those elements forward, and then these other pieces addressed later. You don't have to make a decision about that today.
All right, so then let's discuss just what's today before us.
So
The recommendation for today.
your recommendations, our recommendations with respect to what's before you is establish the committee as a 5-member body, designate the mayor and council president with appointment authority
And I'm
as,
going to amend that. But
Okay.
I'd like to amend that to include the chair of Energy and Environment so that I can represent the committee, so that and for one seat.
okay. In addition to that, qualifications requirements that who serves on a committee must be a registered voter in the city. Also, requirement that city officers and so forth, general managers of the city cannot serve on this committee in order to maintain independence of the body. Clarify in the ordinance that the term of appointment is specific to 6 months to a year after the appointment for the sole purpose of selecting an executive director in the event there's a need to reconvene to,
I recommend we change it from a voter to ratepayer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean the registered voter component? Okay.
The constituency here are ratepayers, not voters.
They
Okay.
probably, they're a ratepayer 9 times out of 10 are going to be older.
Well, no, if they're a business owner, they won't be a ratepayer. They'll be a ratepayer, but they won't be a voter. They could be from anywhere.
That's true. Okay.
No issue. No issue.
Yeah, I'm thinking, let's do like the second-tier people.
Sure.
Okay.
In addition to that, instruct the personnel department to provide administrative technical support to this committee, inasmuch as they have expertise in this area, as well as the city clerk, for the purpose of securing facilities for public meetings, and for these entities and any other city department to collect their costs and report them to the CAO for reimbursement from
Okay,
the
let me ask you this. We can probably vote on those things today, but we also have this issue that Mr. Krikorian has raised. I don't necessarily want to keep this in committee. I wouldn't mind moving this forward, but I need to know if we can come forward with Mr. Krikorian's motion responded to in council so that we can move this forward and hit our time frame.
Oh, you bet. You bet. I mean, I'm not sure if I even need to make a motion. I'm just trying to help the discussion along about, what's already in
Well,
front
I
of
think he has some interesting points, and they need to be on the record.
I would like to recommend, as part of the CLA's report, that we direct the CLA to come back with tentative description of the duties of the executive director and the ratepayer
You
advocate.
want it to come back here?
Yeah.
What do you want to do?
But let's-
It's up to you. I mean, as chair,
I don't mind. I mean, I figure we're going to have a battle out on the floor anyway. Do we have time to come back here one more time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
All right, then let's bring it back one
this
more time.
component can be, you move forward these recommendations here, this discussion about the rate,
Okay.
I mean, you can have that at a later date.
We
You
have
don't
many
even-
ordinances.
but why don't we just
Over here.
peel off the piece about the
Let's do it.
description?
Good.
and
What we're gonna recommend
have
is
that
we
come
have
back.
The rest come back, and if you could, let's do it before July the 1st, okay? I think that would be better to be able to move as much as we can by July the 1st.
Madam Chair, can I also ask that we ask the 5 members to, at least for consideration, to have a member representing business, neighborhood councils, labor, and environment? Not necessarily mandate that they do that, but at least ask that they consider those positions.
Before we leave.
Actually, I want to express my disagreement with that a little bit, because I think the sole role of this Citizens Commission is to appoint an executive director from the perspective of advocacy for business and residential ratepayers. And so I think that categories of qualifications like that outside of consumer advocacy are not appropriate to ask to be filled. The neighborhood council component that Mr. Kretz raised earlier, I think, is an important one because they do serve exactly that role as the representatives of business and individual ratepayers throughout the city. So I'd like to see that one of those members actually be a neighborhood council board member, perhaps selected by the mayor or selected by the council president, but one of them should be a neighborhood council member so that there is actually representation on the selection committee. But beyond that, I think that while the executive director should have utility expertise and expertise in dealing with unions and so forth, perhaps, not the Citizens Commission. Their sole purpose should be selecting someone who's going to be the strongest possible advocate for consumers.
So would you rather just mandate that one person be a neighborhood council board member and leave the rest off?
That would be my view.
I'm fine with that.
Can I just say that I distinctly remember in the discussion, because I raised the point, that I didn't like the notion of the executive director, because the discussion that we had was clear that the issue of public accountability was distinct from the issue of ratepayer advocacy. In other words, that the executive director might have a responsibility to accountability could be contrary to what the ratepayers might be advocating. And so I remember that discussion, and that's why I wanted it to be run by a ratepayer advocate, and that's why I'm saying go back to the discussion, and I think you'll see a lot more clearly that the whole movement toward an Office of Accountability incorporated the notion that sometimes there has to be accountability that flies in the face of what ratepayers might advocate. And I'm telling you, Fred, when I was there, and that was my big concern. I supported both the Inspector General and the ratepayer advocate, and I did not envision it to be what came out, but it was the best we could do in the context of the discussion. So I think if you all look at that tape, or the tapes of the discussions we had, I think you'll get a very different picture than what you're talking about right now.
Before we go, Chuck Ray has put in a card, so I think we need to hear from him now, and then we'll take a vote, get downstairs.
Okay, thank you. At the end of April, I presented a list of requests to this committee from the neighborhood councils basically, they're based on the principles of transparency, independence, and objectivity. Now, the recent report from the CAO, I think, fails to adequately address these issues, and I urge you to create a citizens committee for the selection of the executive director of the OPA that the ratepayers will perceive as being truly representative. The ordinary guys who voted overwhelmingly 78% yes on Measure I need to feel that the OPA will be looking out for them as well as the well-heeled and the well-connected people. So I proposed earlier that, and I realized that there are many ways this could go, an appointment of a 5-member citizens committee, 1 appointed by the mayor, 2 by the president of the council, and 2 by the Los Angeles Neighborhood Coalition. And that would allow stakeholders to feel that it was somewhat more representative. The second point I'd like to raise is that there's some urgency in doing this. The Department of Water and Power has begun its action on its next rate increase. They make no mention of the Office of Public Accountability in any of their 50-some pages of view graphs that they presented last Saturday. Do they mean to get this established by November 1st without any oversight, without any evaluation from an objective source? I certainly hope not. So you have 2 choices. Either you expeditiously create an Office of Public Accountability as the voters overwhelmingly asked for, or you delay the Department of Water and Power's rate action until this can happen. I don't see, an effort to do either right now. I'm very concerned about the upcoming rate increase.
So, Mr. Ray, I don't know if you were there on Saturday because there were so many people, but I started the meeting off. Were you there?
No, I had to miss it, unfortunately.
Well, I started the meeting off by just stating my position on the department's desire to move forward with doing outreach on the issue of rate increases, but I made it quite clear that that would not occur. Rate increases would not occur unless we had an Office of Public Accountability set and a ratepayer advocate in place. And I've been very consistent in saying that publicly and on the record so that they understand, and that anybody else who may want to hold up the implementation of this, that that's not going to happen. So, okay.
We're good.
Okay. All right. So let's take a vote on what's before us today, and then let's schedule time for the issues that Mr. Krikorian and Mr. Alarcon have raised to come back. And I would like to do it before July the 1st.
Your next scheduled meeting is June 21st,
okay.
I believe, so in
Let's
2 weeks.
do it then, even if that means we have to take some things off the agenda to allow us time to really get into that, and make sure that we can have at least a half an hour.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so...
Madam Chair,
yeah,
can I ask just one additional provision with regard to the Citizens Committee?
Yeah.
That you're talking about appointing members. We recommend that the appointing authority who appoints the members has the authority to remove a member.
So you want to add?
It could happen. I mean, you could have a circumstance where somebody should be removed from that committee, and the appointing authority ought to have the ability to remove that person and then appoint somebody else.
So,
No, I'm talking about the Citizens Committee.
where there's the mayor, council president.
Right.
So,
Right.
in addition to that, Fred had a couple of other recommendations, technical recommendations, which including the removal of the acting executive director, and so, actually, no, the acting executive director in event there's a vacancy and so forth, and also the initial budget ordinance.
Okay.
So if we could just add those on.
Yes.
Those are minor technical.
And then the final point I just made before you vote is that we'd like to be conferring with the Personnel Department with regard to the removal of the executive director. The charter provides that the executive director can be removed only for the reasons set forth in the ordinance. So we want to work with the Personnel Department to come up for the council's consideration of language that will capture these reasons comprehensively, because they're the only way you can remove that individual. But that'll take some deliberation between the city attorney's office and the Personnel Department. We'll report back on that.
You report back on that at June 20, what is it?
21st?
21st meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair, one
Yes.
other question. When we meet again to discuss this on June 21st, can we have that initial budget projection for the first part of the budget ready for us at that point too? June 21st, so that we can vote on that and move it forward. It's funded, we're ready to go by the time we get to council.
It would be the recommended budget because the Department of Water and Power has to take the action to fund it within their operation. But at the present time, in their proposed budget that we have seen so far, which is still very preliminary, they have allocated approximately $1 million for this purpose.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, so we have a quorum, and if there are no objections, that'll be the order. Okay, so then, thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. And then that completes the end of items on the agenda. If there's anyone here who wishes to make a comment, public comment, this is the time to come forward to do so for items that are not on the agenda. Otherwise, the meeting is adjourned.